everybody. Thanks for joining me at the Independent Ink with Mr. Fish. What follows is a recent conversation I had with Dr. Cornel West, who I've gotten to know over the years, most recently because I was his creative director for his presidential run last year. So we got to spend a great deal of time together. And we would quite often fall into these deep, probing conversations about what it all means. What does it all mean, and how can we involve ourselves as participants rather than just mere spectators, which I think I probably get into a little bit with our conversation. But anyway, do your best to endure his lavish praise of me, which he's very gracious and a very loving person to do that as excessively as he does, as I sit there with my feet in cement. In fact, he at one point he holds up a book that I had just given to him. We had had lunch together about a week ago, my wife Deanna and his wife Anahita, and it was a rollicking good time, as it always is with him. So that's what he's holding up and celebrating excessively, much to my discomfort. So there's that, and there's also something to notice that you'll notice during the recording is there's a couple tiny glitches. He was recording his side of the conversation with his phone, and his son attempted to call him a couple times, which takes out the audio. So what did I do? I just took the audio out. I just took the visuals out, crunched together, and said, that looks good enough. So deal with that. It's not a terrible distraction, but you can pay attention to that, and it happened on my end and not on your end. So without further ado, here's a conversation that I had with a brilliant humanitarian, a lover of life, and one of my great heroes, Dr. Cornel West. Okay, well, here we are with Brother West, and Brother West, thanks so much for joining me today for this, what is guaranteed to be a riveting conversation of some sort.
Well, brother, anytime I get a chance to spend time with you and Sister Diana too, and with Anahita together, I know we have a good time. But I do want to say though, man, that one of the great joys of my life, one of the treasures of my presidential campaign was being able to work with you though, man. And I say that in all seriousness. You know that art was very much at the center, accenting the moral, the spiritual, the cultural, as well as the political and economic. But the art was at the center of the campaign, and to have a towering artist like you right there standing alongside me and providing those powerful, not just images, but drama in the images, the stories in the figures that you would paint. And for me, it was just a kind of dramatic painting. Tell you the truth, what people could call it, you can call it cartoons or you could call it sketches or whatever you want. But for me, they're dramatic paintings. And your text, though, brother, I just want people to know about this magnificent text here. Oh, yes. Lord, you got both Tolstoy novels. You got On Narcissism by Freud. You got Invisible Man by Ellison. The Native Son by Richard Wright. And it goes on and on and on. It is powerful, man.
Well, this is when I want to say, well, that's all the time we have for today. And thanks for inflating my ego. No, and again, the appreciation goes, definitely both ways. As the people who know my work, and you know me, having me enter into any political arena, it needs to be something more than politics involved. So assisting you in your run was, profoundly moving to me, and also I think necessary for anybody who was paying attention. These are the kinds of movements that we've got to start coalescing and putting forth and inviting people into, and that was really what I was doing there. And you were surrounded by so much love. I mean, people were there, not to figure out how to get their seat at a very powerful aristocrat's table. It was something, we're congregating around, unity of equals, it's just, great
Man,
leadership.
I want to salute Brother Chris Hedges, who I deeply respect and love, as do you,
Yeah.
because he was the one who really mentioned you to me. And I said, well, I know your work from working with Chris, but I said, oh, there's a possibility of Brother Fish. Good God Almighty. I didn't even know your name, Dwayne Booth. I just knew Brother Fish, Brother Fish, Brother Fish.
Right. Yeah, yeah. Well, it all worked out, and all of that will have a lot to do with, I think, what we should be talking about today. Because one of the things I really appreciate um, from you always, and I'm not alone in this, is the number, sort of the broad influences you bring to all of your public discourse, all of your writing, all of your, public pronouncements about what it means to be a radical humanitarian. And one of the things that I really find really moving and unique is your reliance on faith, how faith inspires your radicalism. Because so often when people hear that somebody is a devoted Christian and that they lean on their faith as some sort of way to guide them through a particular darkness, there tends to be this feeling of, how is this person using their faith? What does religion mean to them? Is it giving them permission to exercise their ego in some way? And you're different. You're obviously different. I would say, and maybe you can speak to this too, as people who have influenced you and that part of your life. I would say that there's only a handful of public religious leaders who understand the original message of Jesus.
Ah,
Just as a radical humanitarian, and what that message was, because as we know, Jesus is being misused all over the
oh,
place,
isn't it?
justified great atrocity. So, if you can just talk about that, like your beginnings, like coming out of the Baptist church, which then led you, and this is an interesting thing I really want to get into too, is how did that lead you into philosophy and sort of the deeper searches for deeper kinds of explorations outside of what people typically see as just theology?
No, appreciate that question, though. But I think first and foremost, it begins with Irene. In fact, she died 4 days ago today, though, brother. She's very much on my mind. My beloved mother who has a wonderful elementary school named after her, Irene B. West in Clifton West. My father, and Cliff and Cynthia and Cheryl, my brothers and sisters. That for us, it began in wrestling with the Book of Job. It's one of the great works of world poetry.
Mhm.
How do you deal with overwhelming suffering, undeserved hurt, and unwarranted pain? Is there a way of unflinchingly confronting that and still coming out on the other side with some sense of hope and light and even energy? I mean, when John Keats says the fundamental question of life is energy or despair, there is something to that, because
Mhm.
I think prophetic religion does allow one to have access to a certain vitality and vibrancy in the face of overwhelming evil, so that you keep moving, as it were. I mean, George Santayana used to say religion itself was the love of life and the consciousness of impotence, that you're feeling as if you're powerless and helpless, but lo and behold, you still got this energy and vitality and vibrancy and willingness to fight and keep swinging and loving and laughing
Mhm.
in the midst of the catastrophe coming at you. Now, granted, I also come from a blues people that goes far beyond mom and dad. Shiloh Baptist Church on the chocolate side of Sacramento. That's black folk wrestling with the catastrophe of 244 years of barbaric white supremacist slavery and another 100 years of neo-slavery shot through with lynching and American terrorism, which you capture so very well in so many of your artistic pieces, though, brother, because terror and trauma are very much at the center of any life that is intensely lived, let alone a life intensely lived in the context of oppression and domination. And you have to come up with some sources of love and sources of joy and sources of freedom. You can have a psychic and spiritual freedom even on the plantation. So
Mhm.
we saw it even in the concentration camps with Arthur Miller's wonderful play about precious Jewish brothers and sisters playing such beautiful music in an orchestra in a context of concentration camps. They're still able to hold on to an energy and generate a certain kind of joy and even beauty in the midst of such a vicious and barbaric context. The at the temple. And you can also get it in the nightclub. You can get it on the corner. You can get it in the barber shop. You can get it in the beauty salon. It's a human thing. But in my particular case, all of us are particular and specific creatures shaped by traditions and networks and communities and families. But I got it very much at the West family and Shiloh Baptist Church and the Black Panther Party, which was right next door to
Absolutely.
the church.
Yeah.
Concerned about sustaining that energy and vitality in a direction of trying to change the world, turn it upside down, to revolutionize it in such a way that everyday people have access to power and resources and respect and recognition.
And I'd even say this is, and it's, I love how you're describing all of that, because really another way to look at it is the radicalism and the power and the beauty of that has a very elemental message to it, which is we are all human beings.
Absolutely.
There's nothing beyond that, and I think that what that can do is merely saying, essentially, just to paraphrase, that the meek are not pieces of shit.
That's exactly right.
That indicates that there is something else going on inside that atmosphere to make that a radical idea. And if you can name it, if you can just do that and say, this is the human heart, this is the human experience, and have people shocked by it, that's a real indication that that we're living in a structure of society that has not only lost its way, but has turned the mechanism of society into a catastrophe that needs to be addressed. And I think that that's all of those examples that you gave. And what sustains that is having that community that can look at each other and celebrate the fact that we are a consistency of being that is vulnerable and is precious. And that's as radical and as beautiful as you can get with politics, with religion, with everything else. And that's why I said at the beginning, it can become something of a false start for some people, because when you do say, again, I mentioned Jesus, and this might be an interesting thing to pursue. How would you? Because I know this is where I want to bring in your philosophical training.
Uh-huh.
Because I think that you can find morality in, philosophical explorations.
Oh, sure.
Yeah, and you don't need even to believe in a supreme being that models his or her uh, leadership on on like a moral canonical scripture.
That's right. That's right.
So did you find that, like, for your when you were looking into your philosophical that exploration, uh, where did you find that crossover between your religious training and your philosophical discoveries of human nature and human curiosity, and how that can manifest in a helpful way, rather than a way to set up a hierarchy that then tries to exhibit control over different segments of a society and a population?
But I always try to begin with a Socratic humility, which is to say, acknowledge that everybody's who they are, not somebody else, which is to say, there's a variety of different traditions, heritages, histories that allow one to gain access to that fundamental point that you were talking about, which is that we're human beings and we have a certain sanctity and dignity and preciousness that ought never to be violated, which is another way of saying everybody counts. Palestinians count, black folk count, working people count, trans count, gays count, lesbian count. They matter as precious creatures. And so for the first, I mean, my orientation has always been to historicize, contextualize, pluralize, and therefore humanize, which is to say, we're all human beings in history, in certain contexts, with a variety of different forces. Whatever cultures that we inherit are already hybrid cultures, which is to say, they're pulling from other cultures, going all the way back to the caves. And in the end, what makes us human is our capacity to engage in critical thinking, loving each other, and changing the world to make it better against the backdrop of acknowledging that most of human history is a history of organized greed and weaponized hatred.
Right.
Most of human history is a history of domination, subjugation, exploitation.
Yeah.
And so the question is, how do we create these moments of interruption, these moments of disruption, these moments of eruption with the love, with the self determination, with the dignity, with the self regard, with the self respect that cuts across the board for everybody?
Yeah.
And you see, that to me is part of the the tragic comic drama of being human, because there has not been one moment in the history of the species where you haven't had forms of domination and ugly forms of dogma and too much death.
Right. And so
Yep.
that question that begs the question that one would have to ask then is this not a question of what we think, but how we think? Is human consciousness only capable of creating a concept of reality that it then assumes is the reality that it is going to interact with? If that is the case, if human consciousness therefore only has the ability to interpret reality and not perceive it, which is a lot of what Socrates was about. You know, the purpose of the Socratic Circle was to ask every every time a student or a thinker would get to the point where it looked like they were going to settle on a truth, then the methodology was to keep asking questions to demonstrate that all we really have are our assumptions, and that the truth, in by and large, is a matter of opinion. And that again brings us to that question of, is human consciousness capable of seeing through its its own staged reality? And I don't know if that's even a question that can be answered, but it is one that one has to point to, just given the evidence that you gave, which is true. I think that people have, you know, you can frame it, people have inside of them angels and they have devils, right?
Absolutely. We've
Well,
got proclivities and we've got some wonderful proclivities. But
right.
there's always a battle between the is and the ought. And you have interpretations of the is and you have interpretations of the ought.
Mhm.
But there's also a battle between reality and appearance. I think truth is different than opinion, and which is to say that even on the moral ground, your morality is better than the Ku Klux Klan, and that's not just an opinion. I think that's a fundamental fact of the world when we come to terms with the kind of organisms that we are and the kind of things as organisms we're capable of.
But
See, what
is it only an opinion, because a preferable opinion because it aligns with the instinct to stay alive? You know, because really, when it comes down to it, something like that, I think that inside of us as organisms, as sentient beings, is the desire to live another day, right? And to conceive of the people around us as part of this human family. Right. Now we can get into the conversation about, has that been corrupted by the explosion of the human population as a species on the planet, which then therefore makes it necessary to abstract others and therefore treat others as non-human beings, where before the tribe was much smaller and we were able to exert our instinct for not only our own personal survival, but the protection, the survival of the group. Like, my instinct with my family is not to grab food from my children to feed myself before they are fed. It is to
right.
make sure they are fed before I am fed. So I think that that aligns with that personal uh, instinct to want to live another day. And then we can have a conversation about what is the point of living another day. That becomes a whole philosophical thing, right?
Exactly. Exactly.
But at the ground level, and
Right.
this is what I love about the sort of the radicalism that you talk about, and also connecting it to your faith, is almost getting out of the way of your mind and allowing your heart to provide the wisdom with which to proceed.
Well, you got to go hand in hand, though. You got to have head and heart. You got to have mind and soul, but you have to try to exercise it wisely such that you recognize the limits of both. So, one of the signs of critical intelligence is acknowledge the limits of critical intelligence. One of the signs of a golden heart is to recognize the limits of a golden heart. A golden heart at a Klan meeting for a black man is not the best strategy. I mean, I keep coming back to the gangster Klan
Yeah, yeah.
just to kind of connect it to our present moment with the gangsterism going on right now in the country. But I say that because gangsterism takes a number of different forms and it's shot through all of us.
Hmm.
It's shot through all of us. You go back to Socrates. Socrates himself, as courageous as he was and willing to drink the hemlock and so forth, he didn't draw a distinction between Greeks and the barbarians.
Right.
So he thought the barbarians didn't count. You had to be within Athens in order to really count. Now, he had a student named Antisthenes who Plato attacks viciously in the Republic because Antisthenes called into question slavery, which Socrates never did. He called into question the distinction between Greeks and barbarians, and he called into question intellectual and manual labor. So he sets up his own school right down the way from Plato's Academy, where manual labor becomes a fundamental part, almost like Robinson Crusoe, of his education. That's not true for most academies from Plato to Harvard or Oxford, you see.
Yeah.
And so there, the Greeks have variety, plurality, different contexts, still an Athenian empire, though, shot through with slavery, patriarchy, class domination, and so on. And
Right.
when I look at your powerful work, it reminds me of Juvenal. I mean, Juvenal has got to be one of the most powerful artists, satirical thinkers dealing with a Roman Empire that shot through with corruption and criminality and mendacity. Kind of
Mhm.
sounds like the U.S. Empire again. So you can see certain similarities and commonalities, even though they're very, very different contexts. Roman Empire is different than the U.S. context, U.S. Empire that you're writing under, and of course, the Athenian Empire was different than the Roman Empire. What's common, of course, is empires come and go.
Yeah.
And what's common is you do have truth seekers and truth speakers and truth tellers in each context.
Mhm.
And the most courageous ones tend to be artists, not just the philosophers.
It's true. And I think that the through line with that is artists and I would say philosophers. And I think everybody, if made to address the questions that we're trying to address here in a private setting, they would be serving a kinder version of participation inside of this collective human experience.
Uh,
So what I mean by that, let me just even expand that just a tiny bit, because I think that one of the things that is interesting about Western philosophy and it with ancient Greece and uh, this, I think it was an attempt, and you know more about it than I do, but it always struck me as an attempt to create a concept of civilization which needs an organizing principle. And
uh,
so very often people, when they're looking for an organizing principle, tend to have I know I've used the word several times already, but a hierarchical structure.
uh,
They need something that has instruction, and then they need people to sort of fall into whatever the arithmetic of that structure is going to be and play their role, right? Um, and it makes me think of, well, let's talk about the sophists. When you were a philosopher, that was your calling. You were an enlightened person. Here comes the sophists who want to use those techniques to teach rhetoric and so forth, and to sort of and demonstrate to paying crowds that they are able to argue from both sides of an issue convincingly.
That's right.
And in fact, Socrates, some people accused him of being a sophist, for the
Yeah,
reason.
the sophists were looking for money.
Exactly. Yeah.
Socrates
But
said, "No, no, I'm broke at the Ten Commandments financially. Xanthippe, my wife, don't worry, we're gonna work it out one way or the other. My sons, hold on for dear life, but I'm not taking any money from these folk." So
right.
there's already a certain kind of commodification, corruption, commercialization begins to set in. But the thing about hierarchy, though, brother, is a subtle thing because on the one hand, we got just these ugly hierarchies, the structures of domination and ways in which people are degraded. But there's other hierarchies that are inescapable. I mean, you are a greater artist than I'll ever be when it comes to dramatic portrait. And so, or Toni Morrison's a greater novelist than both of us, and that we just have to accept that. Or Tolstoy, or Chekhov's short stories. So there is a ranking and a hierarchy in terms of cultivated talent. That
Well, let
is,
me pause for a second. I don't mean to
uh,
interrupt you because I might disagree with you only in the sense
sure.
that when it comes to communicating all together in this grand experience that we're all experiencing, I would say that it's more akin to an orchestra. I
Mm,
wouldn't say that if this particular violinist has a greater ability or in a hierarchical structure sits higher than that person over there playing the bassoon. They're just different expressions and different kinds of
oh, I
language
see. Yeah,
that
I see.
contribute to the rich
Right.
experience of life that is connected with what our talents are.
Right.
Because it's not because as we were talking about before, I lead with my heart, you lead with your heart. There's like there's no you can't be anybody other than yourself. And I think if people are once they're given the permission to seek who they are and to find out how to express who they are, that is who they are. And I would say that most people aren't given that opportunity.
That's true.
Yeah, so
That's
there's penalties for that. So it's just like I would say that the majority of a society has to do with being shown a box that we are going to put you in until if you can get to a retirement age and then have enough money to then try to pursue what your passion is and what your real voice is. For many people, it's just too late. They've been ground down with a lifetime of
that's
of
true.
misery and invisibility.
That's
So,
very true. That's very. You remember the moment in Karl Marx's German ideology that he really pulled from Friedrich Schiller's letters on aesthetic education. He wants a society where one is many sided in one's development of personality in a context in which a variety of capacities can be cultivated. It can flower and flourish rather than being locked into a narrow division of
right.
labor and locked into a box, as it were. You're absolutely
Yeah.
right.
And that's the original definition of what anarchism was, right? I
Mm,
mean, the anarchistic society was there to sort of to figure out what is my voice, what is my contribution, where are my natural leanings towards contributing to the group. And
that's
people,
very, very true.
yeah.
But even when you have a conception of an orchestra or a jazz band and so forth, Mary Lou Williams on that piano is still going to play that piano in a different kind of way than Johnny Hodges is going to play his saxophone in Duke Ellington's orchestra. So the
Right.
voices all come together, but in terms of
That's right.
specific playing of the instrument,
Yeah.
there's still a kind of hierarchy in
Oh,
terms of
yeah, yeah, yeah.
talent.
Yeah.
And
Liberace
that's
will not
true
be
for
invited
Dwayne
to that
Booth.
jam
That's
session.
true for Brother Fish. When I think of Brother Fish, I think of Nathaniel West and Mark Twain and Jonathan Swift. I mean, these are the great satirical artists that have the courage to lay bare the lies and the crimes of our society. Usually they get completely marginalized, or rebuked and scorned, or
Yeah.
incarcerated, or assassinated, but in character or literally. I mean, that's what
Yeah,
it
yeah, yeah.
is. They have a prophetic voice, truth
Right.
seeking and truth speaking voice
Yeah.
as an artist. Uh, uh,
I would
and
also I'm sorry.
no, and for me, you see, that makes artists the vanguard of the species, though, brother. See,
Yeah.
what would the species be without that kind of witness, without that kind of courage, without that kind of vision, without that kind of service, without that kind of willingness to sacrifice for something bigger than themselves, to remind us of the art, given the nightmarish character of the is.
Well, again, and then what would the society be? This is the counter to that is what would the society be without the necessity for those kinds of truth tellers?
Yeah, well, that's
I mean,
true.
that because that's because
That's true.
a part of this too has to do with um, the people that you named who are, my heroes, are understood in the context of their time and speaking in the voice of those who understand that language. Outside of that context, there's something else. So,
Mm,
and this brings me and I wonder how much Eastern philosophy you were able to dip into, because that's one thing that I find very fascinating. And let me know if this was also what you understood, and
sure.
to be true with what was going on in India and in China at the time of Plato, Socrates,
Uh-huh.
the Western philosophy. They were asking the same questions without any overlap. Didn't ever seem to be any proof that they had interacted with one another. And it's very interesting to look at what those philosophical explorations, how they were dealt with in both of these regions and where they ended up.
Uh-huh.
Because you have the idea of God being Brahman, in Hinduism. It's not personified. It is all living things. They don't have it. You're also in China and in the region of the world, most of the language, but they were verbs. Same thing with Native American societies. Everything is a process that we are
Mm-hmm.
part of, right? And I always found that really, really interesting, because there are two ways to sort of break down that question of who are we, what are we doing here? Is this absurd? Is this not absurd? And
Right.
and the Buddhist solution, which I love, is that shrug. You know, we can't know with our minds. We can only know with our connection to being.
Uh,
That is a kind of
uh,
silence, right? That is a kind of sort of acceptance into that space, where you do lose your ego. And there is great joy and celebration in being removed from the responsibility to talk about it, because maybe that's what I would like you to talk about.
oh,
You
yeah.
and I have talked about that, where there's that feeling, that elation. We have these transcendental experiences sometime, and these moments
Yes.
of wow, right? That's nonverbal, right?
That's so
And with your
true.
Baptist background, I know that that's part of the celebration of life is a hallelujah moment, which the
Yeah,
hallelujah word, it just means yippee, right?
yeah, absolutely. Well, it's a kind of sense of awe
Yeah.
and feeling overwhelmed, and awe being an appropriate response. But you're raising some very, very deep and fascinating questions. Because one, and this is true in terms of indigenous cultures and all of their richness. Is true of African cultures and all of their richness. Egypt, of course, playing a fundamental role in the shaping of both the East and West. And it's true in the East with all of its richness, that what is distinctive, I think, for me, in my own conception of how I view the world, and it is deeply shaped by by a Christian sensibility, is the complicated relation between nature and history.
Mm.
You see, what's crucial about Hebrew scripture is God makes a covenant with a hated, terrorized, and traumatized people, where history becomes the fundamental arena. I mean, Mesopotamia and other religions that were adjacent to it had tended to downplay history and accented nature more.
Mm.
But when history becomes a fundamental arena, it means in Tikkun Alum, the human agency and human subjects become uh, uh, vessels for the changing and transforming of historical circumstances. Now, once God is pushed out, Diderot and David Hume and a host of others in the West, Karl Marx and Freud and what have you,
Yeah.
then all of a sudden now history becomes the primary arena. Even the psyche that Freud is understanding, still understood in terms of a process, still understood as something dynamic, but it's understood as something that can be wrestled with and coped with, so that in a certain analytical context with the therapist, you can wrestle with your past and emerge at least normally unhappy as opposed to thoroughly neurotic. So I mean, there's some movement.
Yeah, yeah.
And Marx had his own conceptions about history could be different with organized workers, mustering courage and trying to bring to bear powerful condemnation of greedy capitalists and generating something better. So that when it comes to Buddhism, my dear sister Bell Hooks, who I was blessed to work with and write books, Breaking Bread with her, I deeply love and respect, still miss her. She was Buddhist, but she came out of the same Black Baptist context, but she was Buddhist as well. And we used to fight about this because she would say, well, the problem with the West and the Christians and those concerned about history is that they have conceptions of individuality that readily degenerate into rapacious individualism. And so the egoism and the narcissism become primary, or at least something that you never ever completely push back. And individuality goes hand in hand with history again. And I said, yes, that's true. I believe individuality is different than bourgeois individualism. It's different than rapacious individualism. We are creatures who die alone, who laugh alone, who cry alone, but always connected to others. So I believe in a relationality inseparable from individuality, but I don't think that the individual can in any way be dissolved, or even the desires of the individual somehow completely overcome.
Yeah.
And that's, I think, a very different sensibility among Buddhists as opposed to Christians or folk who are tied much more into what they would consider narrow historical consciousness. But I embrace that historical consciousness. I really
Yeah.
do.
Yeah, and I do think that and it's real, and I love having this kind of a conversation, because what it points up to me is that from innumerable contexts, innumerable point of views, everything actually makes sense. There's an argument to be made for that circumstance, for that is the truest, because it is 100% true, as you say, with the historical context. Once you push that into any equation where you're trying to decipher a meaningful life,
Yes.
it's absolutely unavoidable. And just by naming Marx, by naming Freud, that was, and this to me is one of the great gifts of psychoanalysis, and also what was happening in literature at the end of that century, going into the 20th century, are those questions all of a sudden. That in a way, I think, would harken back to what the gift of Judaism was, which was just, who am I? Like, who am I? And I am responsible for my own fate.
Yes.
Right. And so grounding that in what happened at the beginning of the 20th century with Freud and Marx and so forth was that recognition of, yes, there's a plurality. The plurality is made up of precious individuals that, if we know ourselves and we're truthful with ourselves, then we can use the wisdom that we glean from those self introspections to then understand and forgive, give empathy, greater empathy for the people around us, and also figure out a strategy to defang people who are wandering in the dark and being lethal with their confusion. Because
That's a beautiful way of putting it, though.
yeah, and
Beautiful.
I think
Mm-hmm.
it's why it ties in with the art component. And you mentioned jazz, you mentioned blues,
Yeah.
all of that stuff reminds us what it means to mean something. Right? That's educational. It's educational in a deeper way than anything that you can then devise,
And
intellectually.
it's never static, never stationary, always changing, always responding. You hope creatively to new circumstances.
Right.
and new conditions. And that's true in the art, that's true in politics, it's true in physics, it's true in biology, it's true in the human changing condition. I mean, for me, the genius of Judaism and in many ways prophetic Christianity that I'm tied to is a footnote to prophetic Judaism. But the genius of Judaism was not just making history central, but making oppressed people in that history central.
Hmm.
And then comes the art. Do justly, love mercy, walk humbly with thy God. You ought to spread hesed, steadfast love and loving kindness to the orphan, the widow, the fatherless, the motherless. In Leviticus, you must love the stranger. You must embrace the stranger. Hospitality is integral to humanity.
Right.
And then Jesus himself, Rabbi, said, love the enemy. But what is he talking about? He's not talking about liking gangsters and thugs and cowards. He's saying that the enemy is never your fundamental point of reference, that you are here to be a force for good, in the language of John Coltrane. And to be a force for good means, in fact, that you have to be both humble and tenacious in your thinking, your work, your laughing, your creating.
Right.
Oh, we back to the artist again. Paul, he said, the creating. See, when Shelley says poets are the unacknowledged legislators of the world, that last wonderful line of his posthumously published Defense of Poetry, he's not just talking about versifiers. He's talking about all human beings who use imagination and empathy to authorize a different and better world. They are the ones who legislate, ideally, aspirationally, a better world as they confront the evil. It's like what Beethoven said when you get up in the morning. I've got to unflinchingly look at the evil in the world and still pursue beauty. Thank you, Brother Ludwig. And here
Right.
comes Opus 131. Here comes the Ninth Symphony. Here comes the Eroica. But he's got his own personal problems. We know that challenges like every human being
Hmm.
and every artist.
Yep.
But you can see how the legacy of what I'd call prophetic legacy of Jerusalem plays a crucial role. But in here, I have a question for you, though, brother, because I mean, we know Socrates never cries, he never sheds a tear. So there's a sense in which he doesn't put a premium on loving people or neighbors. He loves wisdom. Uh, Anybody who loves somebody has shed a tear for the most part. And Socrates has a real animus against tears. Well, Jesus weeps. Ooh, that's improvement. That's better.
Yep. Can't hear.
Anybody who's ever lived in the world has had to laugh, just like they've had to shed a tear. Where's the
Yep.
mirth of Jesus? Well, Chesterton, Gilbert Keith says, "Oh, he was laughing all the time. It just didn't pick it up." Okay, okay, all
Yeah.
right.
100%. And that's and just speaking about all looking for the language that asks for participation is really what I think is should be a guiding principle to determine whether or not it's language that is attempting to control or it's tempting a language that's
Right.
in asking for participation rather than spectatorship from the people that
That's
it's.
beautiful.
Yeah.
That's beautiful. Absolutely, and that's both artistic but also deeply democratic in the small D sense. It ain't got
Right.
nothing to do with the corporate dominated Democratic Party. Ain't got nothing to do with forms of democracy that are completely colonized
Yeah.
by ruling classes concerned with short term gain.
Yeah.
But we're talking about democracy as a fundamental way of being in the world in which each person participates in the shaping and molding of their destiny and moves from echoes to voices in raising those voices to participate in the shaping of that destiny.
Yeah.
That's something else. But my
Yeah.
question for you is this, though. How do you hold off from the later Mark Twain's misanthropy? What is it that allows you to keep going and not fall into that kind of hatred of humanity once he sees just how decrepit and wretched we human beings really are?
I think that part of of Mark Twain's collapse as an optimist might have had also a lot to do with his economic situation.
Oh, yes, he was broke too.
He did. Yeah. Yeah. So I mean, there was certainly that, but I mean, I don't understand too that what we understand of his perspective at that part of his life was what were unpublished letters, unpublished writings, but then also published writings. Um, if all you had were my cartoons,
Hmm.
I wonder if people, what would be the perception of me as a human, as a person? Because I often get that when people meet me, they're just like, you seem optimistic, you seem hopeful. I would expect something different from so much of the work that you do. But for me, I try to be a fully rounded person. I don't know what Twain was like with his personal relationships. From all evidence, I'm not saying you're incorrect. It did look like that he had given up on what he called the damned human race. Uh, and he had every reason to sort of end up in that space. But luckily, there's something in my physiology that has hope. I know enough people that are equally as hopeful. I know people like you, other public intellectuals, journalists, people who are working to create literally a new language for people to use to know that there is a path forward. Just
Mm.
even minimally. I mean, I used to talk to my students a lot about this, and it seemed from conversations their understanding of history was that human rights were given to the black population in the
Oh,
United States.
right.
The rights were given to women who were asking for the vote. And I was just like, that's actually the wrong way to think about it. The government was forced to recognize that these human rights already exist. So if we have that inside of ourselves, we're just like, we don't have to ask permission from treacherous people to determine our self-worth. We have that, we celebrate it, we seek the company of other people who are in that place, and then we have a cultural movement that is unbeatable when it comes to the the narrow approach of politics, which sees people as segmented and codified into different. You have economic, you know,
Right, right.
all this. I mean, I start to lose. This is what happens to me. I start to get sort of passionate about things, and then words fail, and then it's just like now it's time to draw a picture.
Exactly.
But you understand what I'm saying? It's just like
I
trying to
do,
find
I
that
do, I do.
language forward that reminds people that we are human beings, that we are vulnerable, we're worth saving, and don't allow all the parameters of every public conversation that you're going to have to be determined by by the people who need to maintain the hierarchy and do
Right.
not understand that, for example, that rich people are just poor people with money, right? That's a
Mhm.
revolutionary idea. And that to me is like an artistic interpretation of just like what it means to be have a meaningful life with among,
Right,
other people who
right.
deserve that same kind of respect. So that's what I feel like you're doing. And it's what all the people that I respect to the bottom of my soul are doing. And I think that that's really what we have got to keep doing, and do it with, with truth, justice, and love in mind.
No, I tell you, brother. I think of all of those magnificent portraits you had of truth, justice, and love during the campaign, just blowing people's minds. And I'm telling you, I saw that in Utah, I saw it in Florida, I saw it in Dallas, Texas, I saw it right here in Harlem. But I wondered, it's true, when you try to look for what is the common denominator of William Blake and Nina Simone and William Hazlitt and James Baldwin and Toni Morrison, and we can go on and on. Theodore Dreiser, all of these prophetic figures in their own voices,
Yeah.
trying to speak truth, and the condition of truth is to allow the suffering to speak, especially the suffering of those whose suffering has been rendered invisible.
Yeah.
That I find really just just sheerly almost sublime. That's what takes it to me to somebody like a Jesus who could end up on a cross because He turns over the money changers of the church in the largest edifice east of Rome with 300 imperial Roman troops protecting that temple, and he gets in anyway
Yep.
and
Yep.
turns those temples over, not because he hates rich, because he hates greed. And he turns the tables, especially the ones that are tied to the exploitation of poor people. Well, this is what the biblical scholars say, whether one is literalist or symbolic and what have you. It's a story of a sublime set of acts
Hmm.
that have to do with a love that all of us are capable of experiencing and translating that love into a struggle for justice.
Yeah.
But he ends up, of course, the greatest empire of that day puts him on a cross as a criminal
Yep.
and figures that they have the last word.
Yep. And guess what? And I would even say, even there, I would suggest a slight alteration, even to the uh, suggest that the King James version have the the phrase that he was the Son of God, returned to the original version and say he was a Son of God. Because
Yes, yes,
that, I think, pulls in again. It's just like you don't. Then you. It's not just about the boss's son.
right, right,
Then
right,
it's
right, right.
about the collective.
No, I hear you. I hear you. No, indeed. But then also the flip side is not just Judas, but that all of the disciples disappoint him and stray and
Mhm.
scatter. And the one who he depended on more than anybody else, who would become the foundation of the church. I think about that today with the death of the Pope. Pope Francis dying. At the bottom of the Vatican is what? The bones of Peter. And Jesus said, Peter, you shall be the foundation of this church, of my church, and the gates of hell would not sustain against it, or would not in any way call it into question or undercut it. And yet we know the history of that church is just shot through an accommodation of empire, white supremacy, male supremacy, forms of dogma that have dehumanized people, and somehow that love stream and strand has continued in a very, very weak and feeble way, but strong enough for people to gain access to it and
Mhm.
serve as a basis of critique of the church or any other structure of domination.
Yeah. Well, that's. I think this will be a great way to end our conversation. I'd like to get from you what you think and feel about uh, a strategy moving forward. And again, I'm not asking for bullet points. I'm just asking for what is your hope? Do you anticipate a the potentiality of the human spirit and the human impulse to live another day,
Mm,
to find a way to manifest amid the ugly politics, the commodification of everything being strained through an economic plan, everything being justified by profit alone.
mm.
Do you, how do you see the immediate future and the potential for the human spirit to finally say no more? And do we need to keep teaching or encouraging people to find that language, use it, feel like they can use it without persecution or prosecution at this stage,
Right.
and have that manifest in a way that can literally save the species? Is that too big of an ask, and is that too big of an expectation?
Well, I tell you though, brother, on the one hand, given the dominant evidence of the history of the species, we have no grounds for any kind of optimism in that sense. At the same time, we do have grounds for some kind of hope, which is to say there's always counter tendencies to the dominant tendencies that we must pass on from each generation to the next. I think we're in a moment now where the fascisms are escalating, the unbelievable levels of spiritual decrepitude and moral cowardliness shot through, not just the professional managerial classes, even though that's where so much of the focus is, but more and more our poor and working folk have also been so shattered by the market, so
Mhm.
shattered by conceptions of success rather than conceptions of moral and spiritual greatness, that we're seeing: increasing suicides, increasing levels of depression, increasing levels of giving up and caving in. And yet, thank God, Kendrick Lamar and others remind us there's a whole wave of young folk who, like yourself and like many others, say, as artists, as human beings, we're going to keep alive this banner. We're going to keep alive this bloodstained banner in such a dim and grim moment. And history itself is always unpredictable, because I don't want to be Cassandra like. We don't really know what the future holds. There's a possibility that the whole globe may blow up. You got gangsters right next to the buttons.
Hmm.
There's a possibility the ecological catastrophe could be so overwhelming that here, me in New York, looking at Harlem, could be floating away in 25 years. That's a possibility.
Yeah.
There's another possibility that we could stop it. And we just have to make personal and collective decisions that we want to be on the side of those voices and figures and traditions that are doing everything we can to accent the best potential and possibility that we human beings have had. And there is a significant amount now, but it's just always smaller than the Genghis Khans and the Trumps.
Right.
That's just always a fact.
Right.
And the Genghis Khans and Trumps come in all colors, and the opposition comes in all colors,
Hmm.
all genders, all sexual orientations, all countries and nations. But in the end, we just have to be examples. We have to try to exemplify what we're calling for
On a daily routine.
on a daily basis. See, Socrates exemplified critique. He didn't just talk about it. Jesus exemplified genuine love and compassion. He
Yep.
didn't just talk about it, but
Right.
they paid a cost.
Yep. Yep.
Absolutely. And the great artists, from Juvenile to George Eliot to Joyce to Chekhov himself. Of course, Chekhov is the deepest. We don't have time to get into why I think Chekhov is the deepest of the deepest, but he's a comic writer too. But
Yep.
he exemplified it, not just in his writings, but in his life. And that's true for a brother named Fish. He exemplifies it, and I love it, and I love and respect him.
Well, we've come full circle, and I love you, and I really appreciate you taking the time to talk today.
No, I
Thanks for being here.
appreciate you. Brother, we in it together. You know that, man.
We are. We're in it. All right. So we'll.
Hey,
I'll see you on
hey,
the front lines.
absolutely. Stay strong now, bro.
All right. Bye bye.